Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Liberty Watch. I'm your host, Liberty Man Van. Today we have a special Independence Day edition. And hey, what could be more exciting from a freedom perspective than one of the most important moments for freedom in the history of mankind? The signing and taking forth of the Declaration of Independence. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a quick synopsis for those of you who want just a quick overview of the 4th of July and what it means. We'll go through that, and then for those of you who want a little longer version, stick around and we'll do the extended version. So let's get with it. July 4th, 1776, the so-called Independence Day, or the Declaration of Independence. What does it really mean? We'll look at several aspects of this. First, we'll consider the context, what was going on at the time. And basically, the colonists were already at war with Britain, a war of independence as it would turn out. And after this declaration, the colonies would consider themselves 13 free and independent states. Now, the Declaration of Independence was drafted by the Committee of Five, and we'll cover who was in that committee. Spoiler alert, main author Thomas Jefferson. All right. And so let's just go ahead and get into the document itself. The first section is called the Introduction. And this is one of the most familiar parts of the document, so I'm going to read a little bit from it now. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. And that part is called the Introduction. It kind of gives an overview of why they've decided to declare their independence. And that they think they're obligated to tell the rest of the world exactly why. The next part is the preamble. Again, this is one of the parts that you've probably most familiar with. We'll read part of it here. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Now, the next part is called the Indictment, and that's where the colonists list all the grievances they have with King George. And we won't go into that here in the short version. And then there's a short part called the Denunciation, and then the final part is called the Conclusion. And let's just read the conclusion or part of it here. In the conclusion it says, "We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." And there were 56 signatories, probably the most famous in terms of aesthetic beauty was John Hancock's. Everybody's seen his signature. All right, so let's back up and just parse some of this text here. It says in the introduction, again, to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. So, these folks were all either Christians, and so a few of them were deists, but they all believed in God. Not any atheists in the group that I know of. And let's get to the preamble. And the preamble says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now, unfortunately, there was a group of people who were not free by this, and that was the slaves, of course. So America wouldn't quite live up to its creed for, another 100 years until the slaves were freed. And then not really until the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement until, African Americans got their full freedom. But this certainly put us on the right path, didn't it? All right. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Okay, they're endowed by their Creator with these rights. In other words, these rights don't come from the king. They don't come from the parliament. They come from God, okay? In other words, we don't have to have the king's permission to be free. We're free. I mean, this is a big deal, and some of the ideas here come from English philosopher John Locke. And if you stick around for the long version, we'll read a little bit of his stuff, and you can see how, as far as contributing intellectual content to this document, that's kind of in the background. For example, this phrase right here, life, liberty, and, well, Locke called it life, liberty, and property. But Jefferson decides to word it a little differently, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Note my red, white, and blue today, by the way. I don't normally wear a tie, but I wanted to get the red, white, and blue in. Okay. So, now the next part, right after it says that, it says, they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that in order to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Now, that statement right there, that governments were made in order to protect our rights, that wasn't really true up until this time. It was partially true, but a lot of the reason states were created was to extract resources from people. And that's still true to this day. But they're kind of putting forth this vision that, hey, the only reason the governments exist, okay, the reason they exist is to protect our rights. And if they don't protect our rights, then they really don't have any reason to exist, do they? All right. Now let's get into the grievances or the indictment section, and that's basically just a list of all the grievances against King George, and there were several of them. We'll get into that in the long version. And then the next section, as I said, was denunciation. Let's go through the conclusion again. We read it earlier. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world. Again, these people had a belief in God. That Supreme Judge is capitalized. The Supreme Judge of the world, for rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare, and so on and so forth. And then it gets to the last part, and for support of this declaration with a firm reliance on our protection of the protection of divine providence. There's God in there again. Reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And by putting their signature on this document and putting it out there in the open, it would be published after this. They were putting themselves in danger, okay, of being hanged. And, let's not take our freedom for granted. These people, they put their necks out on the line. They put their necks out on the line for us so that we can, sit around on Independence Day and barbecue and be with friends and family and celebrate. But let's remember that there was a lot of sacrifice involved here. These guys could have all been hanged. We owe them a debt of gratitude. And that's the short version. Happy 4th of July. Oh, I almost forgotten the most amazing part of this whole story. The last two survivors of the signatories of the Declaration of Independence were John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. They died on the same day, July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years to the day of the signing of the document. Now, in their old age, they ran for president against each other in 1800, and it was a very contentious election. And it was so close that it went to the House of Representatives to determine the winner, and it took 26 ballots. That's how close it was. So they had been bitter rivals at one time, but in their older age, they become very good friends, and they had this extensive correspondence with each other. So it's amazing that they would die on the same day. And supposedly John Adams' last words were, "Thomas Jefferson still survives." Little did he know that his friend had died just a few hours earlier. Have a great 4th of July. And those of you who stuck around for the longer version, after that brief synopsis, we're going to go into a little bit more into the context of the Declaration of Independence. Why was this done at this particular time? It was a statement adopted by the Second Continental Congress meeting in the Pennsylvania State House, which is now known as Independence Hall. The Declaration announced the 13 colonies were at war with Britain and now considered themselves free and independent states. And as you'll recall, we'll just review this, the 13 original colonies were New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And this declaration was actually passed on the 2nd without any dissenting votes. It was unanimous. Now, who drafted this document? Well, as it turns out, there were 5 folks that were chosen to be on the drafting committee, the so-called Committee of 5. They were Roger Sherman and Robert Livingston, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and of course Thomas Jefferson. And John Adams actually recommended that Jefferson draw up the original draft, and the rest of the committee agreed to that. So Jefferson drew that up, and then after he brought it back to the committee, they actually did a few additions to it. And if you're a real history buff, you can go look at the original draft and the additions that were made. Excuse me. Now, This document was not created in a vacuum. As we've already mentioned John Locke briefly, and we'll get to him. We'll get to him a little bit more later. But what were some of the other documents that kind of provided the background for this document? One of those was the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And we're going to go through a few of those sections now. Section 1 says of the Virginia Declaration of Rights that predated, just by a few days actually, the Declaration of Independence. And this was George Mason that was primarily responsible for, he was the primary author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. It says that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights, of which when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, namely in the enjoyment of life and liberty, and the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. So this Lockean idea of personal property is very important. And I'm not going to read you all the sections, just a few of the main ones here I think you might find familiar. Section 5 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights reads that the legislative and executive powers of the state should be separate and distinct from the judiciary, the old separation of powers idea. And in Section 8, quote, that in all capital or criminal prosecutions, a man has a right to demand the cause and nature of his accusation, to be confronted with the accusers and witnesses, to call for evidence in his favor, and to a speedy trial by an impartial jury of 12 men of his vicinage, without whose unanimous consent he cannot be found guilty, nor can he be compelled to give evidence against himself, that no man be deprived of his liberty except by the law of the land or the judgment of his peers. So this idea of a trial by jury of your peers, that's in the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And of course this is not specifically in the Declaration of Independence, but it would be in the Constitution itself. Right to a speedy trial, sound familiar? The right to call witnesses. So that all sounds familiar to us, doesn't it? In Section 9, that excessive bail ought not to be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. All right, we won't go through all these. Section 11, that in controversies respecting property and in suits between man and man, the ancient trial by jury is preferable to any other and ought to be held sacred. Section 12 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, that the freedom of press is one of the great bulwarks of liberty and can never be restrained but by despotic governments. Freedom of the press. Section 13, that a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people, trained to arms, is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state, that standing armies in time of peace should be avoided as dangerous to liberty. Wonder what they'd think about our big standing army today. And that in all cases the military should be under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power. So the commander-in-chief is a civil servant, not a military man or woman. Someday. Tough luck, Hillary. Section 16. That religion or the duty which we owe our Creator, there's that "oh God" thing again creeping in there. That religion or the duty which we owe our Creator and the manner of discharging it can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. And therefore all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion. Alright? And that wasn't true in all the colonies at this time, by the way. Some of the colonies had you couldn't vote unless you were certain, you might have to be a Quaker, for example, to vote in Pennsylvania. So it wasn't until we later got to the United States Constitution and put a Bill of Rights in there that freedom of religion would apply to all the colonies. All right. Now let's look at another document upon which kind of serves as a background. Again, this document wasn't created in a vacuum. These ideas have been floating around for a while, and they finally put them together. How about the 1689 English Bill of Rights? So go back even farther. This would have been back in John Locke's day, and we'll get to him in just a minute. 1689 English Bill of Rights. The Act asserted certain ancient rights and liberties by declaring that the pretending power of suspending the laws and dispensing with laws by regal authority without consent of Parliament is illegal. King, you can't suspend these laws without Parliament's permission. Obviously, kings had done this in the past. So they had to try to put some reins on them. And all of these constitutions, the main idea behind them is kind of to enshrine the rights of people and try to put limits on, what governments and kings and so forth can do. And of course, that gives us more freedom. Otherwise, you're just open to tyranny. Okay, let's continue with the 1689 English Bill of Rights. A few of the provisions. It says, levying taxes without grant of Parliament is illegal. It is the right of the subjects to petition the king, and prosecutions for such petitioning are illegal. All right? Prior to this time, there was a time if you tried to petition the king, he'd say, "Off with your head," and that would be the end of it. And it says, keeping a standing army in time of peace, unless it be with consent of Parliament, is against law. And here's freedom of speech again, going all the way back to 1689 English Bill of Rights. The freedom of speech and debates or proceedings in Parliament ought not to be impeached or questioned in any court or place out of Parliament. And listen to this next provision. Excessive bail ought not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. So we know this idea goes back at least to 1689. Okay. Now we're going to cover this guy named John Locke, who was an English political philosopher, and he wrote a couple of treatises on government. And I'm going to read you some from the second treatise, and you'll see some of the ideas of the founding in his ideas. In his second treatise of government, Locke says, of the state of nature, quote, to understand political power right and derive it from its original, we must consider what state all men are naturally in, and that is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and to dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of the law of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. In other words, I have possessions, they're not up to the king to grant me or deny me. They belong to me. All right, this idea of private property, personal possessions, that's a big deal. The natural liberty, he continues, the natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth, and not to be under the will or legislative authority of man, but to have only the law of nature for his rule. The great and chief end, therefore, of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. Remember where this idea goes back to the Declaration when it says, in order to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That in order to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Okay? It goes back to Locke. Let's read the Lockean version one more time real quickly. He says, the great and chief end, therefore, of men's uniting into commonwealths, wealths, that's THS, and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. And that includes your personal property, your life. All right. So finally, let's get into a little bit more of the text of the Declaration of Independence. You heard the short version earlier, but we'll go through it again. It's so poetic. It doesn't hurt to go through it a second time. The important parts anyway. Okay? It says, Introduction, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. We read that earlier. And again, the preamble. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that in order to protect these rights, governments were instituted among men. And, that's the important part there. Governments are there to protect your rights, not to give you Medicare, not to give you Social Security, not to provide you with welfare. We got totally away from the idea of what government's supposed to be. But that's an aside. Okay, so we'll read a little bit more of this in this long version. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So, in other words, if we don't give our consent anymore, you can't represent us. Continuing, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. In other words, when we reform this government, we can do it in the way we think is going to protect us the best. And that what they chose was a representative democracy, a federal republic, as it would turn out. All right, let's go through a few of these problems they had with King George. And that's the part of the document called the indictment. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. Okay. Here's what you've done, King George. Here's a few of them. I'm not going to read all of them. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness of his invasions on the rights of the people. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us, in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us. In other words, the troops could go stay in somebody's house if they wanted to, and they couldn't object to it. Well, they're finally objecting to it. For protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. So they had some people get killed by the soldiers, and they would have these phony trials, and they would get off scot-free. Continuing with the grievances. For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, I guess with the Navy. For imposing taxes on us without our consent. For depriving us in many cases of the benefit of trial by jury. For transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. So in other words, some people were just taken out of the United States to be tried. For abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies. Here's a good one. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. So there, I didn't read you all the grievances, those were some of the main ones. And so we get to the conclusion part of the Declaration of Independence. And we'll read it again. It says thus, "We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America and General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states." And it goes on. I'm leaving a little bit of it out here, and we'll cut to the final part again. "And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." Now, as I said earlier, this was a great step forward in terms of freedom, and that's why we should celebrate Independence Day. We should remember what it's for. And even though slaves were not freed at this time, they unfortunately, weren't covered by this freedom. They would later get their freedom, and If you fast forward to the civil rights movement in the 1960s, Martin Luther King in his famous I Have a Dream speech, he goes through a section there, where he quotes the Declaration of Independence where it says, all men are created equal. And he says in so many words, are you going to live up to the creed?
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal.
And we finally did live up to the creed. Happy 4th of July. And that's the show for today. Thank you for joining us for this special Independence Day edition. If you enjoyed the show, be sure and tell a friend would like to grow the show. You can find text versions, or at least the outline text versions of these videos if you want to go to libertymanvan.com. And if you want to just go straight to the, at libertymanvan.com, you'll find links to my videos. Another way is just go straight to YouTube and look for Liberty Man Van and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And I'm glad you could join us, and I hope you can join us next time on Liberty Watch, where we don't believe you need some guy with a bullhorn to tell you what to do.